Welcome back, folks. In this video, we're going to go over steps on how to do a perfect glossy flood coat, whether it be on straight up color or on translucent and transparent finishes. Stay tuned and let's go. Here's a quick pro tip, folks. You always want to warm up your tabletop epoxy before pouring it. I like to warm mine up for at least 30 to 35, maybe even 45 minutes, just to make sure that that part A, which is the resin, is nice and warm. It makes it easier to stir. The viscosity is a lot easier. It makes it easier to pour, and it makes less bubbles when you're ready to pour that flood coat. I always like to sand my material up to about 220 grit, just to make sure that that flood coat goes on evenly, smoothly, and that it gives you a real pop when you're actually ready to pour it. We decided to do some coasters for this episode, and we wanted to just give you guys an idea as how to pour these flood coats like this. You get your stuff sanded up to 220, and you pour that flood coat, and you'll see how evenly it starts to distribute itself. The good thing about tabletop epoxy is, I'm sure you've heard, it's self-leveling. So that's what you want, especially to get a good overflow on those edges. And what you can do is, because we're pouring circular on a square, you can go back later with your rubber gloves on and you can make sure that all the sides are evenly coated. Now you're going to get a decent overlap or overflow drip on this, but like I said, because it's round going onto square in terms of the pour, you always want to make sure that everything is evenly distributed. I also like to use the excess that overflows and put it back onto the surface of whatever I'm pouring. It helps with the waste factor, and it also gives you more epoxy so that you don't have to mix up anymore. The cool thing when you're flooding epoxy pigment that goes up to the top of the wood that matches the surface of the wood, usually called a single staged pour, like in this situation, the cool thing about that is that you're not really going to see all the micro mini bubbles that sometimes form when you're doing a flood coat. And the reason for that is because of the color and because of the wood. So it really depends on the temperature that you're pouring a flood coat. You always want to have it between 70 and 80 degrees. I always like to go for 80 degrees, just so that those micro mini bubbles can pop and you don't see them. Especially when you're doing a two-stage pour that shows the depth of the material that you're working with, like the wood and stuff, you always want to make sure that that temperature is right so that you don't have any more of those little bubbles. And you always want to have your heat gun handy, whether it's a one-stage pour or a two-stage pour. You always need your handy-dandy heat gun to help you out with things. Once the epoxy cures, then you can sand off the underside drips. I usually like to give it 24 hours, folks, because tabletop epoxy will cure usually between 12 and 16, just depending on the heat, 12 to 16 hours to the touch. But that doesn't mean that it's fully cured. Just because you can touch it and your fingers don't stick to it doesn't mean it's cured. You'll still sometimes get fingerprints in there or smudges, and you don't want that. So whenever you're going to handle these, you always want to make sure it's at least 24 hours that you give it. Now, when you're doing two-stage pours are usually, your first pour is going to be a pour of color pigment. So maybe say an inch and a half of color. Because what you're trying to achieve is you're trying to achieve a depth effect layer. So you want to pour your second stage in clear once that first stage has dried up and cured up. So once you pour that clear stage, it's going to look like glass in between there, and it's going to give off a really super cool 3D depth effect. That's what you go for when you're doing a two-stage pour. Now, we're going to go back to the tabletop, and when you're doing tabletop and you're going to flood coat that two-stage pour, chances are you could run into seeing bubbles just because that second layer of the two-stage pour is clear. You could see bubbles from the flood coat. And the reason being for that is because tabletop epoxy is a lot thicker than deep pour epoxy. The viscosity is a lot less and it's just more dense. So it's always a good idea to, if you can, mix up your tabletop epoxy by hand. That way you lessen the amount of bubbles that are being poured in there. And again, always make sure, folks, that you're pouring in a super warm room. because the heat from the room and the heat from the heat gun should help those dissipate and pop on their own. Let us know which you guys prefer. Do you guys like flood coats on single stage pours or double stage pours? Once again, this has been Steve with Upstart Epoxy, and we'll see you next time.